It is about journeying forward into the future, while also journeying back to remember the past and learn from its lessons.
Last night at 11:23, King Charles signed a document in secret that nobody saw coming. What he did in that dimly lit room has never been done before in 90 years. His hand was shaking. William looked devastated. Palace insiders are calling it the biggest royal since abdication. No scandal, no drama, just a terrifying medical reality they've been hiding from us. By morning, everything we knew about the crown had changed forever. What's really happening behind palace walls will shock you to your core.
And many others like them represent the fulfillment of countless aspirations and the achievement of such remarkable potential.
The signing took place in the blue drawing room at Clarence House, a space that Charles had always preferred for its warmth and personal character. Outside, a deep December cold had settled over London, the kind that seeps into stone and pavement and makes the city feel particularly quiet. Inside, a small group of carefully chosen witnesses stood almost completely silent, watching as the king prepared to alter constitutional history with the stroke of a pen. When Charles finally signed his name, the movement was firm and deliberate. Charles R., written in the distinctive handwriting that had appeared on countless documents throughout his decades of royal service, though none quite like this one. Standing beside him was Prince William, his own pen ready, his face carefully neutral despite the visible tension in his posture. The witnesses had positioned themselves in a semicircle behind the two men. Princess Anne, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chamberlain, and a senior representative from the Privy Council all stood watching. Nobody spoke. The only sounds in the room were the scratch of pen on paper and the faint ticking of a mantel clock that had once belonged to Queen Elizabeth. When both signatures were complete, Lord Chamberlain stepped forward to apply the official seal. The document was then placed in a leather portfolio, ready to be delivered immediately to the Constitutional Affairs Office, where it would be registered, copied, and distributed to the appropriate governmental and Commonwealth authorities. There was no champagne, no congratulations or celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement from the Archbishop, who spoke a brief blessing in the low, careful tone of someone who understood they were witnessing something genuinely rare. A king was preparing for his own potential incapacity, and a son was accepting a burden he had hoped would remain theoretical for many more years. By the time the witnesses left shortly after midnight, the document was already moving through the constitutional machinery. Secure messages were being sent to prime ministers across the Commonwealth. Legal advisors in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and more than a dozen other realms were being woken up to review the changes and prepare for coordinated public statements at dawn. But in London, where most of the country slept completely unaware that anything significant had occurred, the night remained quiet. There were no leaks, no dramatic announcements, just the steady, careful work of an institution preparing itself for realities it hoped would never arrive, but could no longer afford to ignore. When dawn broke on December the 16th, the world would learn that the succession had changed, not in the dramatic way of abdication or death, but in something more measured and distinctly modern. It was a recognition that monarchy, like any institution, must adapt to the complexities of human frailty and medical reality. To understand what drove Charles to sign that document on a cold December night, you have to look back to the autumn of 2025, when a series of medical appointments began revealing truths the king could no longer dismiss as temporary inconveniences. It started in late September with fatigue that simply wouldn't lift. Charles, who had always maintained a demanding schedule and took pride in his stamina, found himself needing afternoon rests that stretched longer than he intended. Engagements that once energized him now left him completely drained. His private physician, Sir Hugh Withbone, who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, noticed the pattern developing and quietly requested comprehensive testing. The results, delivered in early October, weren't catastrophic, but they were definitely concerning. Charles's heart function showed signs of stress consistent with his age and the decades of demanding schedules he had maintained. There were early indicators of vascular fatigue, nothing immediately life-threatening, but conditions that required careful management and would likely progress slowly over time. More significantly, the testing revealed that Charles's capacity for sustained high-level decision-making was beginning to show strain under prolonged stress. It wasn't dementia or cognitive decline in the traditional sense, but rather a subtle reduction in stamina that affected his ability to process complex information during long working days. Sir Hugh delivered the news with characteristic directness during a private meeting at Balmoral in mid-October. He told the king that he could continue his duties effectively for some time, potentially years, but that they needed to be realistic about managing his workload and preparing for the possibility that at some point the demands of the role might exceed his capacity to fulfill them without risk to his health. Charles sat in silence for a long time after that conversation, staring out at the Scottish landscape he loved. He had waited his entire life to be king. He had become monarch at an age when most men were long retired. And now, barely 3 years into his reign, he was being told that his time might be more limited than he had hoped. The constitutional problem was immediate and unavoidable. The British monarchy operated under laws designed in an era when medical science couldn't sustain life or manage chronic conditions the way it could now. The existing provisions for regency, created after the abdication crisis of 1936, assumed a binary state. A monarch was either fully capable or completely incapacitated. There was no legal framework for partial capacity, for a king who could fulfill some duties but not others, for a gradual transition rather than a sudden crisis. Charles understood the implications instinctively. If his health declined to the point where he could no longer fulfill his constitutional duties, the current system would require a formal declaration of incapacity, a process that would be messy, public, and potentially destabilizing. Parliament would need to intervene. The Councillors of State mechanism, designed for temporary absences, was completely insufficient for long-term health management. Even worse, the lack of clear protocol meant that in a health crisis, the transition to William would be reactive rather than planned, chaotic rather than orderly. Charles, who had spent his entire life preparing for kingship, couldn't stomach the idea of leaving his son to inherit the crown under those circumstances. He raised the issue privately with William during a walk at Sandringham in late October. The conversation was difficult, not because William was unwilling to discuss it, but because both men understood what it represented. Charles was acknowledging his own mortality and fragility. William was being asked to prepare for a burden he had hoped wouldn't arrive for many more years. William's first instinct was denial. He told his father that he was healthy, that he was managing well, that this all seemed premature. Charles shook his head. He explained that he was managing now, but that Sir Hugh had made clear that his capacity would likely decline gradually, and when it did, they couldn't afford to have the constitutional framework decided in a crisis. They had to plan now while they could do so thoughtfully. William had no response to that. He simply walked beside his father in silence, both of them feeling the weight of what was coming. Princess Anne, brought into the discussions in early November, was characteristically pragmatic. She pointed out that this was precisely why succession planning existed, that Charles wasn't abdicating, but ensuring continuity. There was no shame in that, she insisted. But Charles did feel shame, though he tried not to show it. He had waited so long to be king, and now he was preparing mechanisms to ease himself out of the very role he had spent a lifetime training for. It felt like failure, even though intellectually he understood it was wisdom. The medical reality that had forced this reckoning wasn't dramatic. Charles wasn't dying. He wasn't suffering from a terminal illness. He was simply aging, and aging in a role that demanded more than an aging body could sustainably provide. It was the most human of problems, playing out in the most public of lives. And so through October and into November, Charles authorized his legal advisors to begin drafting a solution, a constitutional mechanism that would allow for a managed transition, a way for William to assume royal powers gradually if Charles's health required it, without the drama of abdication or the chaos of sudden incapacity. By mid-November, the draft document was ready, and Charles faced the most difficult task of all, asking his son to read it. The legal framework governing the British monarchy had remained essentially frozen since 1936, when King Edward VIII's abdication had forced Parliament to clarify succession law in ways it had never needed to before. The resulting legislation, crafted in the shadow of a constitutional crisis, was designed to prevent another Edward situation, to ensure that abdication required parliamentary approval and that the line of succession remained absolutely clear. But what the 1936 reforms hadn't anticipated, what no one in that era could have possibly foreseen, was the revolution in medical science that would unfold over the following 9 decades. In 1936, people died quickly from conditions that are now managed for years. Leaders either functioned fully or they didn't. There was no grey area, no prolonged decline that modern medicine could extend and manage. By 2025, that binary assumption was dangerously outdated, and Charles, along with his legal advisors, understood that the monarchy couldn't afford to wait for a crisis to expose the gaps in succession law. The core problem was simple. If Charles became unable to fulfill his duties due to declining health, the current law provided only 2 options. He could abdicate, a process that required parliamentary approval, public announcement, and the permanent surrender of the crown. Or he could be declared incapacitated, a process equally public and equally dramatic, requiring medical assessments, Privy Council intervention, and formal installation of a regent. Neither option allowed for what Charles's physicians predicted was most likely, a gradual decline in capacity that would make some duties manageable and others too demanding. There was no legal provision for a king to step back partially, to hand certain constitutional functions to his heir while retaining others. And there was certainly no provision for doing so quietly, with dignity, without turning the transition into a public spectacle. Charles had watched his mother navigate similar questions in her final years. Queen Elizabeth, determined to serve until her death, had gradually reduced her schedule and delegated more to Charles himself. But those delegations had been informal, based on mutual understanding and palace tradition rather than legal framework. And when Elizabeth died, the transition had been sudden, immediate, and managed only through years of advanced planning. Charles didn't want his own transition to depend on either sudden death or public crisis. He wanted a mechanism that acknowledged reality, that allowed for managed change, and that protected both the institution and his son from unnecessary trauma. The problem became even more pressing when Commonwealth realms began asking questions. In October 2025, constitutional advisors in Canada had quietly reached out to the palace, asking for clarification on what would happen if the king's health deteriorated gradually rather than suddenly. Similar inquiries came from Australia and New Zealand. These weren't hostile questions. They were practical concerns from realms that needed to understand how their constitutional arrangements would function if Britain's monarch faced health challenges, and the palace's inability to provide clear answers was itself revealing a systemic problem. Princess Anne, who had spent decades observing the monarchy's structural vulnerabilities, pushed hardest for immediate action. She told Charles during a November meeting at Windsor that they couldn't govern based on hope. They couldn't assume he would remain fully capable until sudden death. Medical reality didn't work that way anymore, and their constitutional framework had to acknowledge that. The legal team working on the solution faced extraordinary challenges. They needed to create a mechanism that was legally binding across 15 Commonwealth realms, each with their own constitutional structures. They needed language that was clear enough to prevent ambiguity, but flexible enough to accommodate different scenarios. And most delicately, they needed to craft something that wouldn't be interpreted as Charles admitting weakness or preparing to abdicate. The solution they developed over those 8 months had 3 key innovations. First, it didn't require a formal declaration of incapacity. Instead, it allowed the monarch to voluntarily transfer specific constitutional powers to the heir, if medical advice suggested such transfer would better serve the crown's stability. The decision remained entirely with the monarch, but it was based on medical reality rather than political pressure. Second, the transfer could be partial and gradual. William could assume powers over certain areas such as hosting state visits or conducting investments, while Charles retained others, such as weekly audiences with the Prime Minister or approval of certain state documents. This flexibility acknowledged that capacity wasn't binary, that someone could be capable in some areas while struggling in others. Third, and most importantly, the mechanism was designed to be reversible. If Charles's health stabilized or improved, powers could be returned. This wasn't abdication disguised as health management. It was a genuine attempt to create constitutional flexibility that respected both the institution's needs and the individual's dignity. The Commonwealth realms, consulted secretly throughout the drafting process, had responded with cautious support. Most recognized that their own succession laws needed similar modernization. Canada's constitutional advisors had been particularly helpful, drawing on their experience with prime ministerial transitions involving health concerns. They understood the practical necessity of having clear protocols in place before a crisis emerged. Australia's response was more complicated. Republican sentiment there meant that any discussion of succession naturally triggered broader debates about whether the country should maintain its constitutional monarchy at all. But even among Republicans, there was acknowledgement that if Australia was going to remain a realm, having clear succession protocols was preferable to constitutional ambiguity. New Zealand's government had actually been the most relieved by the proposed changes. Their Prime Minister had privately expressed concern to palace officials months earlier about what would happen if a health crisis occurred without clear protocols. The new mechanism answered those concerns directly. The legal language had to be precise enough to satisfy constitutional experts across multiple jurisdictions while remaining comprehensible to the general public. The drafting team went through 17 versions before arriving at wording that everyone could agree on. Each version was vetted not just by British constitutional lawyers, but by their counterparts in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other major Commonwealth realms. One of the trickiest aspects was defining what constituted sufficient medical advice to trigger the protocol. The team eventually settled on requiring consensus among 3 senior physicians, including the King's personal doctor and 2 independent medical experts appointed by the Royal College of Physicians. This safeguard ensured the process couldn't be triggered frivolously, while still allowing for timely action when genuinely needed. Another challenge was determining which powers could be transferred and which had to remain with the monarch. Some constitutional functions were so intrinsically linked to the person wearing the crown that transferring them would effectively mean abdication. The team identified these core functions, things like formally appointing a prime minister after an election or giving royal assent to certain types of legislation, as powers that would remain with Charles even if everything else transferred to William. By early December, the document was ready. The final draft sat on Charles's desk at Clarence House, a thick sheaf of papers bound in the traditional blue covers used for constitutional documents. It represented 8 months of intensive work, countless consultations, and the careful navigation of legal complexities that spanned multiple nations and constitutional traditions. But before it could be signed, before it could become part of Britain's constitutional framework, Charles needed to share it with the person it affected most directly. Prince William, his son, his heir, the man who would bear the burden of this new constitutional arrangement. The document would arrive at Kensington Palace on December the 12th, and with it would come a conversation that neither man particularly wanted to have, but both understood was necessary. The future of the monarchy and the relationship between father and son was about to change in ways that would echo through generations. The envelope arrived at Kensington Palace on December the 12th, delivered by royal courier under the highest level of security classification. William's private secretary brought it to him during a late afternoon meeting, interrupting with an apologetic expression that immediately told William this wasn't routine correspondence. From His Majesty, the secretary said quietly, "For your eyes only, to be read in private." William dismissed the meeting and sat alone in his study as winter darkness gathered outside the windows. The envelope was thick, bound with the King's personal seal. Inside he found 2 items, a formal legal document, the draft of the Transitional Regency Protocol, and a personal letter from his father, handwritten on Clarence House stationery. William read the letter first. "My dearest William," it began in Charles's distinctive sloping script. "What follows is difficult to write and will likely be difficult to read, but it is necessary, and I believe you will understand why." The letter explained in more personal terms than any medical report could what Charles had been experiencing. The fatigue, the medical consultations, the growing awareness that his capacity to serve as king might be limited by time and health in ways he hadn't anticipated. Charles wrote with a vulnerability William had rarely seen from his father, acknowledging fears and frustrations that the king would never express publicly. The letter stated that Charles didn't know how much time he had to serve effectively. It might be many years, it might be fewer than he hoped, but he couldn't in good conscience leave these questions unanswered until crisis forced answers upon them both. The letter concluded with a request. "Read the document, consider what it asks of you, and when you're ready, let us discuss it together. This isn't something I can decide alone." William set the letter aside and turned to the legal document. The language was dense, filled with constitutional terminology and legal provisions, but its core meaning was clear. If Charles's health declined to the point where medical advice suggested a partial transfer of duties, this protocol would allow William to assume those duties without the drama of abdication or formal incapacity proceedings. William read it twice, then set it down and stared at nothing in particular. His first emotion wasn't preparedness or duty, it was a refusal. He didn't want this responsibility, not now, not like this. His father had waited his entire life to be king. William had expected to wait similarly long. The idea of assuming royal powers while his father still lived, still wore the crown, felt wrong in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Catherine found him an hour later, still sitting in the darkening study. She turned on a lamp and sat beside him without speaking, waiting for him to find words. "He wants me to share the crown," William finally said, "while he's still alive, while he can still function." Catherine glanced at the documents on his desk. "Is he ill?" "Not acutely," William replied, "but it's declining gradually, and he wants to manage the transition while he can still make clear decisions about it." Catherine considered this. "That seems wise." William shook his head. "It seems like I'm waiting for him to weaken so I can take his place." "That's not what this is," Catherine said gently. "This is your father trying to protect you from having the transition happen in crisis. He's giving you time to prepare. That's a gift, not a burden." "It feels like both," William admitted. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, London's evening traffic hummed distantly. Inside, the weight of succession pressed down on both of them, with a force they had intellectually prepared for but emotionally weren't ready to bear. Catherine spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "Your father spent 70 years waiting, watching his mother work until she died in office. He knows what that cost her, and he knows what it would cost you if he did the same. This isn't a weakness, William. This is him loving you enough to spare you the worst of what he endured." William looked at her, seeing the strength that had made her such a steady partner through everything the royal role had thrown at them. "You think I should agree to this?" "I think you should talk to him," Catherine replied, "and I think you should understand that refusing this doesn't protect him. It only makes the inevitable harder when it comes." William knew she was right, but knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally remained two different things. He requested a meeting with his father for December the 14th. The 2 days between gave him time to consult privately with constitutional experts, to understand fully what the document entailed, and to prepare himself for a conversation he had never imagined having. The meeting took place at Clarence House on a cold evening that smelled of approaching snow. Charles had set aside 2 hours, clearing his calendar completely. They sat in the same blue drawing room where the signing would eventually take place, though neither of them knew that yet. William began carefully. "I've read the document and your letter, and I understand why you believe this is necessary." Charles waited, sensing the hesitation in his son's voice. "But I don't want to appear eager for this," William continued. "I don't want people to think I'm pushing you aside." Charles leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. "You have never been eager for my position, William. You've carried your role with reluctance and duty in equal measure. No one who knows you could possibly believe you're pushing me aside." "Then what will they believe?" William asked. "That you're too weak to continue? That the crown is crumbling?" Charles shook his head. "They'll believe because we'll tell them clearly that we're modernizing how succession functions, that we're planning responsibly for realities that medical science has made newly relevant. There's no shame in that." William looked down at his hands. "This means you're preparing to step back." "This means," Charles corrected gently, "that I'm preparing for the possibility that I may need to step back. If that time never comes, then this protocol sits unused. But if it does come, we'll be ready, and you won't be forced to assume everything at once during a crisis." The conversation continued for over an hour, moving through practical details and emotional undercurrents. Charles explained the medical realities he faced. William expressed his fears about assuming power prematurely. And gradually, through the kind of honest conversation fathers and sons rarely manage, they reached understanding. Charles talked about the conversations he'd had with his mother in her final years, about watching her refuse to slow down even when her health was clearly declining. He spoke about the toll it took on her, and the guilt he still carried about not pushing harder for her to delegate more responsibilities. He didn't want William to carry that same guilt. William, in turn, shared his own fears. He worried about being seen as impatient, about the public thinking he'd been waiting impatiently for his father to fail. He worried about their relationship changing, about duty creating distance where there had been genuine affection, and perhaps most deeply, he worried about whether he was truly ready for the immense responsibility that came with wearing the crown, even partially. Charles listened to all of it without interruption, then responded with an honesty that surprised them both. "I don't know if anyone is ever truly ready," he said. "I certainly wasn't, despite 7 decades of preparation. But you have something I didn't have. You have time to transition gradually, to grow into the role without the shock of sudden succession. That's what I'm trying to give you." By the time William left Clarence House that evening, he hadn't yet agreed to sign, but he had agreed to consider it seriously. And Charles, reading his son's face, understood that consideration would lead to acceptance. Not because William wanted this, but because he understood, as Charles did, that the crown required it. 2 days later, on the evening of December the 15th, William returned to Clarence House with Catherine. He had made his decision, and though it pained him, though it felt like stepping into his father's shadow before his father had fully stepped out of it, he understood that this was what duty required. The signing would happen that night, and by morning, the line of succession would function differently than it had for nearly 90 years. By 10:45 in the evening on December the 15th, the blue drawing room at Clarence House had been prepared for a ceremony that no one present would ever forget, though few outside that room would fully understand its significance. The furniture had been arranged with careful attention to both formality and intimacy. A mahogany desk, borrowed from the palace archive and used historically for treaty signings, sat at the center of the room. 2 chairs had been placed before it, one for Charles and one for William. Behind them, space had been made for witnesses to stand at a respectful distance, close enough to observe but far enough to grant the moment appropriate solemnity. Princess Anne arrived first, punctual as always, dressed in a dark suit that seemed appropriate for the gravity of the occasion without suggesting mourning. She greeted Charles with a brief kiss on the cheek and a searching look that asked without words whether he was certain about this course of action. Charles's slight nod confirmed that he was. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, arrived moments later, his presence lending spiritual weight to what was fundamentally a constitutional proceeding. He had been briefed in detail over the preceding days and understood that while his role was ceremonial, his witness would be recorded in history. The Church of England, after all, had been intimately connected to succession questions since Henry VIII, and this moment, quiet though it was, represented another evolution in that long relationship. The Lord Chamberlain, Baron Parker, came next, carrying the official seals that would validate the document once signatures were applied. As the senior officer of the royal household, his presence ensured that the procedural requirements were met precisely. The final witness, Dame Margaret Whitmore, represented the Privy Council. Her role was to ensure that the signing complied with constitutional requirements and that the council would be properly notified to ratify the changes at their next meeting. Prince William arrived at 10:58, accompanied by Catherine, who wouldn't witness the signing but whose presence William had quietly requested. She remained in an adjacent room, close enough that William knew she was there, but respecting that the signing itself needed to involve only those with formal constitutional roles. Charles and William stood together for a moment, father and son, king and heir, sharing a silence that carried decades of complicated history. Then Charles gestured to the chairs and both men sat. The document lay on the desk between them, illuminated by 2 standing lamps that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. The Lord Chamberlain had placed 2 fountain pens beside it, traditional instruments for state documents, both bearing the royal cipher. The Archbishop stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "Let us begin with a moment of prayer." What followed was brief, a blessing that asked for wisdom, strength, and divine guidance for both men as they undertook this solemn act. When the prayer concluded, the Lord Chamberlain formally presented the document, reading its title aloud. The Transitional Regency Protocol, establishing revised procedures for the transfer of royal powers in circumstances of the sovereign's partial or progressive incapacity. Charles took up his pen first. He read through the document one final time, his reading glasses reflecting the lamplight, his expression composed but carrying unmistakable emotion. When he finally began to sign, the room held its collective breath. Charles R. The signature was firm, each letter carefully formed, the final flourish on the R as decisive as it had been on thousands of previous documents. But this one was different. This one changed the fundamental relationship between a king and his heir. Charles set down his pen and looked at William. The expression that passed between them was complex, carrying apology and hope and sorrow and pragmatism all at once. William understood at that moment that his father wasn't giving up. He was giving William the tools to take over gracefully if that became necessary. William picked up his own pen. His hand, witnesses later recalled, was steady. He read through the passages that pertained specifically to his responsibilities, the powers he would assume if the protocol was ever activated, the duties he would perform in his father's name. Then he signed. William. He didn't use a regal signature as he would when he became king. This wasn't about assuming the throne, this was about sharing its burden. When both signatures were complete, the Lord Chamberlain applied the official seal, pressing it firmly into the red wax that had been prepared. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, final and irrevocable. Dame Margaret stepped forward to countersign as witness, followed by the Archbishop and Princess Anne. Each signature added weight, transforming the document from theory into constitutional reality. Anne, as she signed, allowed herself a rare display of emotion. She placed her hand briefly on Charles's shoulder. Charles reached up and covered her hand with his own, a moment of sibling solidarity that spoke to decades of shared duty and mutual respect. The Archbishop offered a final blessing, his hand raised over both Charles and William. When the ceremony concluded at 11:27, there was no applause, no formal congratulations. The Lord Chamberlain collected the documents and placed them in the leather portfolio that would carry them to the Constitutional Affairs Office. The witnesses departed quietly, each understanding that what they had seen would be discussed for years and remembered as a turning point in how modern monarchy managed succession. Charles and William remained in the blue drawing room after everyone else had gone. Catherine rejoined them, moving to William's side without a word. Queen Camilla, who had waited in her private sitting room during the signing, entered quietly and stood beside Charles. For several minutes, the four of them simply existed together in the aftermath of what had been done. The document was signed. The future was now structured differently than it had been an hour earlier. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "Thank you," he said simply, looking at William. William nodded. "It was the right thing to do, but it wasn't an easy thing," Catherine added quietly. Charles smiled faintly. "The right things rarely are." They parted shortly after midnight. The lights in Clarence House dimmed, and London settled into the few remaining hours before dawn would bring the news to a world that didn't yet know the monarchy had fundamentally changed. The document signed at 11:23 on December the 15th had altered more than legal procedures. It had altered the relationship between father and son, between king and heir, between present and future. The crown hadn't weakened, it had adapted. And in that adaptation lay its continued survival.